Although 3 weeks has gone by since the taped interviews were played before the governing body, and apparently 17 other persons have heard them, and still no direct accusation against Ray Franz, but now he knows he's implicated. Ray goes on, what I knew I had learned entirely from other sources, not from the governing body, of which I had been a member for 9 years. The Bethel headquarters members who were grilled and put on trial had phoned me, voicing their dismay at the unkind, intolerant attitude shown. They expressed their belief that the ones directing the whole process were simply going through them in order to reach their true objective, Edward Dunlap and myself. They felt that such ones were taking what they considered to be the more strategic course of beginning with the small people, the lesser known and less prominent ones, establishing their guilt, making it seem as if the situation was of great and dangerous proportions, and then, having laid as strong a possible foundation as possible, proceeding to deal with the better known and more prominent ones. Rightly or wrongly, this was the impression they had. It would be interesting to hear from those of the Chairman's Committee, to whom all reports ultimately went, and who answered all questions for direction of the investigating and judicial committees, to hear what possible reasons that committee could have had for proceeding in the manner they did. When Chairman Schroeder phoned me on May 8th, I expressed my feelings, how difficult I found it to understand why, after living and working together week in and week out for 9 years with the members of the governing body, 15 years with some, not one of them had had the brotherly considerateness to communicate with me as to what was taking place. In all fairness to the members as a whole, it must be granted that they may not have known in detail how the Chairman's Committee was handling matters. They may not have known the content of Albert Schroeder's phone conversation with me on April the 23rd, and the misleading responses my questions received, though it seems possible, even probable, that the conversation was taped, as later developments would indicate. Either way, it must be acknowledged that some or many of the members may have expected and believed that the Chairman's Committee was conducting matters on a very high level, in accord with Christian principles, doing to others as they would have done to themselves. And I think it's worthwhile to remark here that, as usual, Ray Franz gives the benefit of the doubt to his fellow members of the governing body that they, maybe more than is apparent, did not know what was really going on, at least in detail, because it was assigned to the Chairman's Committee during this period, and Albert Schroeder took the lead. Ray goes on, I then asked Albert Schroeder what his feelings would have been if at the time he was in Europe conveying his thoughts of a different application on the critical phrase, this generation. Some in Brooklyn, on hearing of this, had brought accusations of apostate leanings on his part. And then he had begun gathering together any other expressions he might have made anywhere, at any time, to anyone, as evidence to substantiate that grave charge. And had done all this without even communicating with him to advise him of what was taking place. How would he feel? He gave no reply. I told him I would go to Brooklyn as requested, and the conversation came to a close. So in all of these situations, you can see Ray is leaning in the direction of what should a Christian do? What would Jesus do? The first consideration being fellow feeling, loving someone enough to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But as he goes on, this is not the way the governing body works, as we'll see in his subsequent remarks. By the time I arrived in Brooklyn on May 19th, the continual toll on my nerves had brought me to a state of near shock. There seemed to be something so irrational about what was happening, the methods used. Some called it a nightmare. Others felt a stronger term was needed, namely paranoia. Innocent Christians were being treated as if they were dangerous enemies. Then he makes an interesting comparison with something that had happened just a few years earlier in the United States, Watergate. Recently, he says, I ran across an item I had read in clips some years ago from the New York Times, headed Mistrust Found in Nixon's Staff. Among other things, it said, A psychiatrist on the White House staff from 1971 to 1973 says the inner group around Richard M. Nixon deeply mistrusted the motives of other people, viewed concern for people's feelings as a character flaw, and could not respect loyal opposition or dissent. Dissent and disloyalty were concepts that were never sufficiently differentiated in their minds. Dr. Jerome H. Jaffe said, quote, "That really was the tragic part. To dissent was to be disloyal." That is the theme that recurred again and again. The administration admired people who could be cold and dispassionate in making personnel decisions, he said, to make concessions to people's feelings, to recognize that a particular objective was not worth destroying people in the process of its attainment, was not something that elicited any admiration among the staff at the White House. Such a concern was viewed as a fatal flaw. They deeply distrusted the motives of other people and were unable to believe that people could rise above selfish motives, he said. And that's the end of the quote from the New York Times. Ray goes on, "I find it frighteningly close parallel between this and the attitude shown in Brooklyn in the spring of 1980. To dissent was to be disloyal. That is the theme that recurred again and again. The kindness of Jesus Christ seems so seriously missing. Any warmth of friendship, the compassionate understanding that gives friendship its warmth, seemed replaced by a cold organizational approach that assumed the worst, gave no benefit of doubt, and viewed forbearance and patience as a weakness, inimical to the interests of the organization, to its goals of uniformity and conformity. It was as if some massive legal machine had been put in motion and was grinding along in an unfeeling, unrelenting way toward its ultimate objective. I found it hard to believe it was actually happening."